Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. We have the great pleasure of welcoming Dr. Butterfield, who's going to be giving a presentation on the fall of the Roman Empire. For all of those who are not familiar with Ralston College, we are a new college. We are in our 4th year currently, and we're based in Savannah, Georgia. We have a very special master's program, which takes place both in Greece and in Savannah. We will be sending out a lot of information about this, but if you are curious about this and you're hoping to apply, we do definitely welcome you to do that. We have our final deadline on February 27th, and we still have a number of full and partial scholarships that are available. And we are very much looking for eager and curious minds that want to delve into the many jewels of the past. So we will be having a brief presentation from one of my colleagues, Connor Livingston, who is a fellow at the college. He graduated with me last year. And then we will be moving on to Dr. Butterfield's presentation, finalizing with a Q&A session where you are more than welcome to submit your questions. You can do this throughout the length of the webinar, and we will address them at the very end. You should have a Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. So without further ado, I will pass this on to Mr. Livingston.
Well, thank you, Rosa Maria. Like she's mentioned, her and I just graduated last May from Ralston College with the Master's in the Humanities. And I have the privilege of being able to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. David Butterfield. He's the Provost of Ralston College. He's also a professor of Latin. And he is also someone I have had the good fortune of being able to learn from directly. I spent a full month with him on the island of Samos, being able to witness him give lectures on the pre-Socratics with the background of the Aegean Sea. And it was just wonderful. And I'm also have the good fortune of having him as my advisor, as this year I'm a research fellow with Ralston College, working on a book on Stoicism and mental health. And Dr. Butterfield is helping me through that process as I work on that project. And it's always a really great privilege to hear him speak, especially when it's about something as important to me as Rome and Stoicism. And so I'm very excited to hear him talk about the fall of the Roman Empire tonight, and I know it's going to be a delight. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Butterfield for that lecture.
Thank you, Rosa Maria. Thank you, Connor. And thank you to all of you around the world, wherever you are, for joining us. It's a real pleasure for the Ralston College team to have an unknowably large group of unknowably varied people tuning in to get a sense of what our lectures, seminars, and subjects of study are like. As has already been said, I'll talk for a while, maybe half an hour, about a massive topic, such as the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But the most exciting part for me isn't hearing me talk, it's getting a sense of what questions you would like to ask. So please do use the Q&A function within the call to record any questions as and when they come up. And hopefully we can work through as many of those as possible at the end. So, the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It's not a small topic. Indeed, it's incredibly vast, but it's vexed, puzzled, challenged, and to some degree inspired people throughout the world over the last 1500 years since the 5th century AD. It's not simple in any sense of the word. Anyone who believes it's simple to explain how and why Rome fell is either deluded or trying to pull your leg. Well over 400 separate theories have been advanced since the 5th century all the way down to the present. Clearly, no single answer can be correct, but what makes this still an interesting and a productive subject of inquiry, despite its complexity, is that one can rank the importance of various theories and ideas and form a particular amalgam or union of the dominant theories. And what I propose to do today, with apologies to those of you who are already expert in the subject, is first to trace the overall arc of the Roman Empire under the rule of its emperors down to the 5th century, to point out some milestones which are very important in terms of the evolution and decline of the empire, and then end with 6, half a dozen theories, which I think each play a major role in the answer as to how this decline happened, but leave space for you to suggest others that I don't mention. So then, off we go. When we talk about Rome, people often think of Romulus, and I want to begin with Romulus. But I don't want to begin with the Romulus, brother of Remus, who founded the city of Rome way back in what we now call 753 BC. I want to begin with a very different Romulus. This Romulus had a father with a similarly storied name, Orestes. But that Orestes was not the slayer of his mother Clytemnestra as punishment for her slaying her husband Agamemnon. No, this Orestes was a diplomat, a general, and an ambassador. Rather strangely, he, despite being of Roman origin, was the ambassador and general for Attila. And that's that Attila the Hun, who in the mid-5th century AD was causing great consternation in Europe from the basis of Pannonia, which is roughly in the area of modern Hungary. That Orestes had a son, Romulus, and Romulus was indeed the ruler of Rome. But what did that mean? Frankly, not a lot. Romulus Augustus was the final emperor in the Western series of rulers. But he was nicknamed not Augustus, but Augustulus, Mini Augustus. Why? Because he was 10 years old. And this 10-year-old, appointed by his father Orestes, after the death of Attila the Hun had brought him back into the Western Empire, was then, to some degree, and ever since to a major degree, regarded as the last figure in the imperial line of the Western Empire. How did we get to a scenario where the biggest empire the world had yet seen, which covered most of Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, spanning 5 million square miles, containing somewhere between 50 and 100 million people, how did that get to be run by a 10-year-old appointed by a father who worked for the great enemy of the Romans, Attila the Hun? Before I trace the history that takes us to that rather sorry final moment of the Western Roman Empire, some obvious provisos, which are obvious and important, but in a sense, they're quite boring. So, in brief, I'm talking about the Western Roman Empire because in the East, the Eastern Roman Empire lives on, and indeed it lives on for another 1,000 years, all the way down to 1453, until Constantinople is overthrown by the Ottomans. That's the Eastern Roman Empire, but to them, they were the continuation of the Roman Empire. They called themselves Romans. They believed that Constantinople as New Rome was the continuation of the Roman world, and it is not for us to tell them they were wrong. So I'm talking about the Western side of the empire at this point. Similarly, although it's commonly said, and it's much more interesting to pick a moment in time, namely AD 476, when Romulus is deposed by an invading figure called Odoacer, things did not change overnight. The Roman Empire, just as it wasn't built in a day, didn't fall in a day. Instead, as we'll see, there are various things going on in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries AD, which all have a hand. However, it does remain the case that after Romulus was deposed in 476, that figure Odoacer sent the imperial insignia, the very symbols of imperial rule, to the east, to Emperor Zeno, effectively saying that this is no longer a place where there is a Roman emperor. And that invading figure Odoacer called himself a king, the king of Italy. And that word king had been anathema to the Romans for the last millennium and more. Clearly, something had changed for a non-Roman invading figure, not just to depose the sitting emperor, this 10-year-old boy, but also to send the imperial insignia away, to call himself a king, and for the world to move on. So, I know, and you know, how complex this is. 476 is the place we're going to get to. Okay, let's rewind from Romulus Augustus to Augustus himself, the great and first emperor. After the Battle of Actium and the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra, Augustus does become the sole figure governing the Roman Empire. And by this point, I'll refer to my trusty map. Hello, gravity strikes. By this point, the Roman Empire is almost as large as you can see. What you see here, coloured in various colours, is the largest size of the Roman Empire in 117 AD under the Emperor Trajan. It never gets bigger, and in fact shrinks soon after when Hadrian, Trajan's successor, says, okay, this is a bit of overreach, let's pull it back in. But by the time of Augustus, at the end of the 1st century BC, beginning of the 1st century AD, most of what you can see here was already in the Roman Empire. And Augustus advised his successor, not his son, but his successor Tiberius, that fundamentally we've got enough imperial land. Nevertheless, the followers of Augustus were not quite comfortable to just sit on their hands, and plenty of expansion occurred. Britannia is taken by Claudius in AD 43, and there are other extensions, Dacia in the early 100s, and a few other places dotted about. But fundamentally, the Roman Empire in its scale had mostly been won by the time Augustus ceased his rule in AD 14. But the big problem of Augustus's imperial rule was that he was too successful. That is to say, the model of imperial rule he created was something that effectively no successor over the next 400, 500 years was able to live up to. So you will know the Julio-Claudians, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, are a series of disasters of different kinds. And in AD 68, when Nero is forced to commit suicide as the army turns on him when he's aged 30, that marked not just the end of the Julio-Claudian house. To many contemporary Romans, it potentially marked the end of this terrible experiment of having emperors, and it opened the door to returning to a republic, where 2 consuls elected annually would balance power and then hand it on, such that the terrible early days of the kings, those autocrats, would never be among us again. And in that year, AD 68, also known as the year of the 4 emperors, different figures outside Rome think that they can step in and improve things. Over in Spain, Galba and Otho, 2 generals and governors based out in Spain, and Vitellius up in Germania, modern Germany, and out here, Vespasian in Judea. These 4 generals think that actually there's now opportunity for them to step in. Otho kills Galba, Vitellius defeats Otho, Vespasian defeats Vitellius, and Vespasian heads to Rome. And he's the first emperor who is not from an aristocratic family. He's an equestrian, as it were, wealthy middle class, who's worked his way up the ladder by virtue of his military career. What's interesting for our story is that Vespasian, as the 9th emperor, has the luxury of doing what no previous emperor had done, namely, seeing his blood son, his actual son, succeed him as emperor. Everything before that is so turbulent and chaotic, and to some degree tragic, that son does not succeed father until the 10th Emperor Titus in 79 AD. Okay, then things continue. We're now in the Flavian dynasty, and unfortunately Titus, after 2 years, dies and Domitian comes in. He's an absolute nightmare. 15 years of genuinely autocratic rule, in which he demands that he be referred to as Dominus et Deus, not just master, that is master over the slaves that are the Roman populace beneath him, but also Deus, God. Domitian, unlike earlier emperors, seems genuinely to believe that he is the embodiment of divinity, rather than someone who on his death is destined to be made divine in the afterlife. Okay, Domitian's a disaster, and in AD 96 he's over. And he's so bad that the next 5 emperors are called the 5 good emperors. These are Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. And generally speaking, that period of the second century AD is still relatively stable. But there's a couple of things we should pick out. The first is that Nerva, the emperor from 96 to 98, is really the last major emperor who's chosen by the Senate. The Roman Senate, as you know, is that body of senior figures and magistrates who've earned their stripes by virtue of holding office within Rome, and collectively, they should have a decent amount of wisdom as to how to keep the city and its empire ticking on. But after Nerva, the Senate do not decide upon the emperor. So who does? Sadly, it's not a democratic system where the Roman people vote on which emperor will do them best. Instead, there's been a shift of power. Although Augustus had all of the rhetorical tricks to say, I am not imperator, I'm merely the princeps, the leading citizen among our surviving republic. I'm primus inter pares, the first person among equals. Clearly, that's a logical and indeed a mathematical impossibility, but the rhetoric was there that the emperor was effectively just a Roman citizen who was most dominant in the survival of the republic. Practically, that was a nonsense. That's already clear under the time of Augustus, let alone Tiberius and Caligula. And what that means is the Senate as a deliberative chamber, as a place with any executive authority, becomes a myth. They're just role-playing effectively. And although there's still a lot of social status in rising to be a senator and to be elected a consul, it doesn't hold meaningful power. In an empire of this size, power is with all of those Roman citizens spread around the empire at the frontiers, namely the army. And if you are a general with a major legion or indeed legions behind you, thousands upon thousands of Roman citizens who are at your beck and call and will do what you demand, you really do have the power to change politics back in Rome. So generally speaking, throughout the 1st century BC, from that year of the 4 emperors, 68 onwards, it's military leaders who really are the kingmakers, as it were, when it comes to appointing Roman emperors thereafter. If the army are not on your side, especially the imperial bodyguard called the Praetorian Guard in Rome, not only do you have no chance of becoming emperor, but if you are emperor and they turn against you, they really will kill you. There are many, many emperors who are openly or secretly slain by the military because they've decided that this particular emperor doesn't have their own interests at heart or has become so deluded that he needs to be dispatched. So we get ourselves down to Marcus Aurelius, who, of course, is famous for his own Stoic contemplation. But Marcus Aurelius marks the last of the so-called good emperors. Why? Not because he doesn't have a successor. In fact, his son Commodus enters the imperial court for 12 years, 180 to 192. But Commodus is a disaster. He is a cruel, tyrannical, bad emperor, even spoken in his own times in such terms, and he really does mark a shift. What happens after he's dispatched? Well, it's not the year of 4 emperors, it's the year of 5, 193. Chaos all around the empire once more, and it's from North Africa that Septimius Severus steps into the imperial robes as the first African emperor to date, the first genuinely foreign emperor, that is to say, not part of the Italian mainland. And the Severan dynasty takes us through to 235, and fundamentally, we're clinging on to some degree to the empire at that point. Let's pause at 235 because there are 3 more things to mention before we advance. The first is the big question of citizenship. To be a Roman citizen, civis, was a big deal. Not only did it gain you legal rights and protections within the empire as a whole, but it effectively made you the same as everyone else who had attained that status. And although initially Roman citizenship was limited to those at Rome, it spread as the Roman Empire did throughout Italy. By the early 1st century BC, Italians are allowed to take up most of the rights of a Roman citizen. As various Roman colonies expand around the empire, the Romans living in them are also Roman citizens. But crucially, the Romans allowed 2 routes into citizenship, which helped bring the conquered peoples of the Roman Empire more aligned to Rome as an imperial project. One might think that if Rome is expanding largely by military conquest, by fighting, and by mass slaughter, the whole of the empire would be a constant battle against every individual to stop him or indeed her from killing you. Now, although it's true that there is a huge amount of rebellion over the centuries in the empire, it's also true that many people under imperial rule felt incentivized to align and assimilate with Roman rule rather than to fight as a rebel continually. I don't want to psychologize why they are thinking in those terms, but economically and culturally, there's plenty of Roman assimilation that occurs. And one thing the Roman Empire allows is that if you are a local in any given tribe that has been conquered by Rome, and you serve as a magistrate in the governance of the town, which is now under Roman rule, that can win you full Roman citizenship. And if you were to go to Rome, you would be treated just like any other true Roman citizen. So you can earn Roman citizenship through your own career within the management of your hometown. Secondly, although you needed to be a Roman citizen to fight in a legion as a legionary, there were huge amounts of soldiers who were auxiliaries. They supported the Roman military machine. And if you served for 25 years as an auxiliary, you became a veteran and you were awarded Roman citizenship. So either through service within your town, doing the kind of things that aligned with Roman requirements, or through fighting in the army for Rome, you could end up with exactly the same status as one of the blue-blooded families of Rome itself. Now, that's only a route open to some people. So what we estimate is that in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, it's no more than 10 or 15% of the whole of the Roman Empire that are citizens. Everyone else, therefore, doesn't have full rights or legal protections, and that could cause them great harm and suffering in their own lives. But a really important thing happens in 212 AD. The emperor then is the son of Septimius Severus, a guy nicknamed Caracalla. And Caracalla issues what's called the Constitutio Antoniniana, which more simply is called the Edict of Caracalla. And for reasons that remain unclear, Caracalla decides in an instant that every free person in all of the Roman Empire, which might be 80 million people, instantly becomes a full Roman citizen. It's only slaves and some ex-criminals that are separate from that decree. So suddenly we go from a world where maybe 20% of the empire are citizens to something like 80% plus being citizens. The least unlikely, that is to say the most probable reason for Caracalla doing this sudden change is to increase the tax base, because a Roman citizen is taxed in different ways from a random subject of the empire, and it would have helped the beginning economic crisis. But we don't know what was going on. One would have thought that that change would help solidify the empire in its Romanness. If now 4/5 of people are Roman citizens just as much as someone in Rome, then that would suggest a more holistic body. In fact, the opposite is true. If Roman citizenship is effectively automatic for anyone who isn't a slave, so any free person, male or female, even though women have fewer rights as citizens compared to men throughout this period. The opposite is true, namely that there is no social status to earn to become a citizen. It's not a mark of your good deeds, be they military or civic. It's simply the base status. And what that ends up opening the door to is people looking for social status by other routes, and turning to your immediate community and certain national or religious identities provides a route towards that. So somewhat paradoxically, as I say, this granting of mass Roman citizenship actually debases Romanness rather than spreads it as a great benefaction. The two other things to say about the 3rd century are about what follows Severus Alexander. He's the last of the Severans, and in 235, he's gone. For the next 50 years, 235 to 284, 49 years, we have what's called the crisis of the 3rd century. And it's a crisis in all sorts of ways. But in terms of the imperial line, it's utter chaos. In those 49 years, 41 different figures around the empire claim to be emperor. And they don't just claim to be the Roman emperor. At times, the map behind me splits into 3 separate kingdoms. People in Gaul, people in Palmyra are declaring themselves emperor, whilst there's also an emperor at Rome. And it really looked possible that the Roman Empire, as we knew it, would collapse in the mid-3rd century AD. It's a miracle to some degree that it didn't. After that extremely unstable 50 years, someone steps into power who sees that things have got to change. It's no longer tenable to rule an empire on this scale with an army which maybe has 500,000 soldiers within it and takes up 80%, 4/5 of the whole budget of the Roman Empire, spent on all of these 500,000 soldiers spread around. It's not workable, not least. Oh, that fell. That would be drama. That'd be worth tuning in for. Hopefully that was sustainable. Rome is not well situated to govern this empire. Now, it's not as though the empire was gained by accident. No, it was by design. But Rome is where Rome is, and it's not even a port. It's up the Tiber, not particularly close to any of the important frontiers. It's awkward. So what happens in 284 is that this new emperor, a general called Diocletian, says things are going to have to change. And at this point, I'll share my screen, although I remain paranoid that that's going to fall. We will see. I'm just going to briefly share my screen to show you this map, because it changes the world as we know it. Hopefully you can see this map, which I'll just talk about for a minute. What we have is the appearance of the Roman Empire. That's everything in color, or at least in a bright color. And Diocletian, on becoming emperor, first divides the empire in half between him and Galerius. Between him and Maximian. And then he divides it again. So he quarters the Roman Empire. And the reason this is so important for our story is that whilst Diocletian decides that being in the east, in this purple color, is the place to be, with the capital in Nicomedia, when he divides up the other 3 territories, Rome gets left behind. So on his system, Diocletian is the main man in the east as Augustus. His deputy, Galerius, is Caesar in Dalmatia. And in the west, Maximian governs Italy, Spain, and Africa as Augustus of the West. And Gaul and Britain are governed by his deputy, the Caesar Constantius. 2 reasons why this is significant. First, we have 4 people actively governing the empire. But secondly, they're tiered. There are 2 Augustuses, who are the main men, and they have an understudy called a Caesar. And the plan was, and it's an ingenious plan, that when the Augustus steps down, the Caesar steps up, take that position, and a new Caesar would come in as deputy. The second really important thing is that Rome is no longer a capital. The last time that Rome was a serious place for a Roman emperor was in 235, when Severus Alexander came to his end. He was the last emperor who treated Rome as a place for a serious base. As I say, it's just not strategically well placed for an empire that is constantly dealing with influx of tribes over the Rhine and over the Danube. So the capital moves north to Mediolanum, modern Milan. Alongside Milan, there's Trier, Augusta Treverorum, towards the north of Gaul. There's Sirmium, which is now in modern Serbia, right on the river Danube. And Nicomedia exists because we're not yet in the days of Constantinople. So Diocletian realizes that no single person can rule the empire as is. Either we scale it down or we have to work as a team. That takes us to the end of the 3rd century AD. And the 4th century AD is less about the movers and shakers of the imperial line. It's more about the rise of something I am yet to mention, but need to mention, which is Christianity. Christianity, of course, begins with Christ, which means it begins in the first generation of the 1st century AD. But throughout the 1st century, Christianity is not a major force in the Roman Empire. Indeed, by the year 100, it's estimated that there are only about 10,000 Christians in the Roman Empire, that is to say, in the world. So Christianity is still not a big deal, even despite the apostles, all of the work of Paul, Peter and Paul reaching Rome. It's not a major force. But thereafter, it grows at a remarkable degree. By 200, maybe there are 250,000 Christians. By 300, maybe 6 million. And by 400, the majority of the empire, maybe 35, 40 million. These figures are very precise. They're guesswork of a kind. But there is almost an exponential growth in the 3rd and 4th centuries in particular. Prior to the 3rd century, it didn't really matter if you were a Christian or not. Yes, we hear of times when they are explicitly persecuted, generally made scapegoats of, a bit like the Jews were at the same time, because they weren't quite playing the same polytheistic game as most Romans and other peoples conquered by Rome. However, there was a general species of religious tolerance in the Roman Empire in those earlier centuries that meant you could be a Christian so long as you didn't rub it in anyone else's face. That Edict of Caracalla had several downstream consequences, and one of them related to Christianity. In 249, the Emperor Decius decides that Romans need to pull together culturally. We're in the middle of this 3rd century crisis. And if everyone's going to be a Roman citizen, as they now are after the Edict of Caracalla, well, they should act like them, and they should perform a sacrifice to the Roman gods. So there's an explicit decree that all Roman citizens throughout the Roman Empire in 249, 250 need to do a proper Roman religious sacrifice. Naturally, Christians who will not honor the gods of the Roman world, in many cases refused to do that. And they were killed, they were martyred, and that was one of the major flare-up moments of martyrdom in the early days of Christianity. Things then quietened down for a while until under the same Diocletian, the start of the early 300s, there's the so-called Great Persecution, when Christians in particular are targeted. It could have been, at this point, that the concerted effort to turn on Christians, their places of worship, and their shared scripture could have meant the decline, even the destruction of the religion. Were it not for the fact that that four-way system created by Diocletian was soon going to fall apart. Because one figure, Constantine, was not prepared to operate with a mere quarter. And Constantine spread, eventually fighting Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in Rome in 312. But on the very night before fighting, he sees in the sky a light of the cross and becomes convinced that Christianity is actually not just the religion for him, but the religion that needs tying to the future of Rome. Constantine the Great goes on to do many things, but one of the important things for Christianity is in 313, he issues an edict, the Edict of Milan, which mandates religious tolerance of Christianity. You cannot persecute Christians. That holds through the 4th century, except for his nephew, Julian the Apostate, who's a bit of a teenage rebel, and he tries to bring back polytheism in a serious way, but that doesn't last for more than a couple of years. And when we get down to Theodosius, at the end of the 4th century, he issues in 380 the Edict of Thessalonica, which makes Christianity explicitly state religion. Now, for Edward Gibbon, who, as you know, wrote a huge, sprawling, wonderful, immensely learned 6-volume account of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, all the way down to 1453, he felt that Christianity, in the 4th century in particular, ended up being a major factor in the destruction of the empire. His thesis fundamentally was that Christians, in honoring a god in the realm beyond the mundane, and not honoring an emperor and the civic duty of Rome, meant that the shared energy and investment in the very Roman project was diluted and lost. There is some truth to that, and certainly there's economic truth in that a lot of lands, a lot of money was handed over when certain wealthy individuals died, not to the city and its coffers, but to the church, to the local bishop. And the parallel rise of ecclesiastical figures, the clergy, alongside Roman imperial figures, is indeed an awkward and contested moment for the future of the Roman Empire. Because the Christian church may have many things to do in the world, but caring specifically about Rome and Roman imperial rule is not one of them. Okay, that takes us towards the 5th century, and the big change in the 5th century is less the collapse of imperial authority or the rise of Christianity, as it is the movement of people. So I'll share another. I've only got 2 of these, so this is the latter share. I'll share this with you so you see what I mean. The first of my 6, and much the most important explanations for the relatively rapid collapse of the Roman Empire in the West in the 5th century, is the movement of people. And as hopefully you can see here, what we have in different colors with arrows of travel, marked as 100 to 500 AD, but really primarily 4th and 5th century AD, is the mass migration of peoples. And all of these peoples, to begin with, exist outside that northern boundary of the Roman Empire, across the Rhine and across the Danube. What happened was that the Huns, I began with Attila the Hun, they were an Asian people from somewhere on the Eurasian steppe, and they moved into Northern Europe. They weren't prepared to let the tribes they encountered stay where they were. They wanted their land. And so it sets in motion a chain series of migrations of incredible scale. So as you can see, once the Huns are here, that causes the Vandals to move ahead of them into Gaul, into Iberia, across to Africa. And on conquering Africa in the mid-5th century, the Vandals used Carthage, now renovated as their base, to attack the Roman Empire from different angles. Equally, the Franks move into North Gaul. The Angles and the Saxons come to found what we then called Angloland, but is now England. And the various Gothic tribes, the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, travel too. What's important to understand about this moment is that these are not invasions in the sense of these peoples wanting to take over the Roman Empire and be the new rulers. It's easier to see many of them, albeit not all, as refugees of a kind. They've been destabilized from their land. and they want to find a place where they can have stable land and stable food supply. Naturally, that does cause conflict with wherever they settle, and so battles do happen, and they do indeed have armies. But it's really a cause and effect sequence of people feeling destabilized, ultimately, it seems, by the incursion of the Huns. And just to show you how this lands in a material way, the Huns caused the Goths to travel into the Roman Empire in 376. And although the Goths are initially given space to settle, within 2 years at the Battle of Adrianople, or the Battle of Hadrianopolis, the Goths kill the emperor. Emperor Valens is killed by the Goths, who are dissatisfied with the status quo. Another concrete example, the Vandals, once they've been driven into North Africa, end up passing through where Augustine is based. Augustine is Bishop of Hippo, and he is writing at the time the millions of words that he produced. And at his death in 431, 430 or 431, his city is being besieged by Vandals. So Augustine is seeing the empire collapse around him. More particularly in 410, the Visigoths actually storm Rome, and for 3 days, Rome is sacked by the Visigoths. It appears that this was out of dissatisfaction at not getting what they want, rather than wanting to conquer Rome, which is why they left after 3 days. But that is the first time in 800 years, since 390 BC, when the Gauls came into Rome right up to the capital, that Rome had been breached by an enemy. So clearly, in the 5th century, things were turning rapidly with this mass movement of dissatisfied and increasingly angry people. And the Vandals themselves end up sacking Rome in 455. That is, without question, in my mind, the major factor that catalyzes the decline of the empire. The other 5 can be covered briefly, and I'll do that very quickly so we can get questions, because I know I've gone on a bit. The other 5 I would name in my half dozen, alongside migration, are the decline of the army. The army fundamentally was too large to be funded by an increasingly impoverished Roman Empire. What's more, the demography of Rome was producing fewer people whose true allegiance was to Rome and the Roman project. Increasingly, ever more far-flung and foreign peoples were being brought into the army as mercenaries, as foederati, that is to say, allied fighters. And as such, not just in their training and equipment, but actually in their fundamental commitments, they were a less coherent and centralized body. Similarly, the Praetorian Guard, that elite army which was based at Rome, was destroyed by Constantine as punishment for Maxentius having the audacity to fight him as a usurper. So without that central army based in Rome, things become diluted and much more complex. So that's number 2, the decline of the army. Number 3 is massive. That's economic decline. And that begins really from the 3rd century, early 3rd century. We have debasement of the coinage, where it's deliberately decreased in precious metal value so that it goes further. But of course, that causes hyperinflation and corruption throughout the 3rd century. What's more, most of the gold in the empire, which is a finite resource, is moving east. It's buying the expensive things that come from Asia and further beyond in the east. The spices, the silks, all of the really luxurious goods come in the east and not from the west. So gold is lost. And the result of this, with the huge expense of the army, is that the army are not being paid properly. Therefore, they demand more money, which often means overthrowing the current emperor because a new emperor will pay them off. And we get into a vicious cycle of things getting worse and worse as the army want more and more. Tied with that, with all the civil wars, all the incursions, all the fragmentation, the actual tax base that underpins the Roman Empire decreases. So income goes down. Reason 4 is a series of natural problems. By that, I mean both climatic issues. So generally from 200 BC to about 200 AD, Europe is unusually warm. It's called the Roman climatic optimum, and agriculture was doing well. We were growing wine in England, for instance, during this period. And then that generally stops, and it seems as though there's an agricultural downturn just to natural forces in the 3rd century AD. Combined with that is plague. There are 2 major plagues. One is the Antonine Plague, probably smallpox in the 160s and 70s, which kills millions upon millions of people. And in the 3rd century, we have the plague of Cyprian, so called because Cyprian describes it, which was something pretty brutal in the 250s and 260s AD. Maybe it was Ebola, some kind of hemorrhagic fever causes absolute mayhem during that crisis. What all of this means is that with fewer people, with less good conditions, agriculture declines, which ties into that third reason of the economic decline, slowing down the prospect of the Roman Empire surviving in the West. Fifth, we have the fundamental division of empire. Although it was necessary for Diocletian to divide the empire to keep it surviving that crisis of the 3rd century, it fundamentally is the case that no one really competently is able to rule the single empire again. And although Constantine does indeed become all-powerful, he sees the direction of travel, and he moves his capital from Rome to what he calls New Rome, Nea Romi, out in ancient Byzantium, what he calls Constantinople. And Rome never regains its power. Milan is the major Italian base. Constantinople's where the energy is. And therefore, there's no real sense that the energy is ever going to return to Rome, and it doesn't. In fact, in the 5th century, Milan is thought to be so poorly located that Emperor Honorius moves the capital over to Ravenna. Why? Just because Ravenna is better to defend. So it's really on its last legs as a location by that point. The final thing to say is fundamentally the weakening of political power. It just doesn't mean much to be emperor in the West in the 5th century. The fact is, most emperors are puppets. They are puppets of very influential generals who move behind the scenes in and around Rome. Most of them have the title Magister Militum, meaning head of the army, and really they are the movers and shakers. People who couldn't become emperor because they didn't have the right optics, people like Stilicho and Aetius and Ricimer, and indeed Orestes, they are the people with power, which means the imperial line really has become just a veneer, a showcase, rather than actually having genuine executive authority in the West. Okay, I've gone on a bit, and we've had some potential drama with the map, but we're still here. So I'm going to stop at this point, even though there's so much more to say, and take a look at the Q&As to see what we might move on to. Okay, so we have a question which is asking whether there are any surviving sources from the 5th century AD that try to reckon with the empire's decline in religious terms. In other words, were Romans assigning religious significance to the empire's likely collapse? That's a great question, and the answer is an interesting one. Although we have very, very little literature from the 3rd century and early 4th century AD, we have lots from the 5th century. And the most prolific of all Roman writers was Augustine. And as I said earlier, Augustine, although in North Africa, was not only watching Rome face its struggles, but he was writing to Roman refugees who in 410 had fled the city when Alaric with the Visigoths came in, and they'd fled to North Africa for safety. And those Romans were often aristocratic families who'd been there for centuries. And they weren't yet Christians. And they were saying to Augustine in North Africa, this amazing, frightening invasion of the city may be an act of the gods, an act of the traditional gods of Rome, who are punishing us for following Christianity. Where does Christianity have the interests of Rome at heart? And we know that these conversations were happening because Augustine tells us as much. And what's more, he writes the longest work of Roman argumentative text, the 22-book work, The City of God. And the City of God is all about explaining, first, how Roman religion, traditional Roman religion, does not in any sense have the interests of Romans at heart. And you can just look at the history of Rome to see that. But fundamentally, Romans should not be panicking about the loss of Rome as a place. Rome is just a city within the world. It's a city of man. It's terrestrial and mundane. What really matters is a city we can each access within us, wherever we are in the world. And that's the city of God, which you access through faith. So that work, that huge, sprawling, and indeed Christianity-changing work, The City of God, was a product of exactly the kind of debates you're talking about in your question. Clearly, Romans felt that Christianity was jeopardizing the future of Rome, but it was the conviction of Augustine and many other church fathers that actually Christianity provided the route forward rather than explained the decline. Just one quick note on that. Although these invading tribes are often called barbarians, almost all of them were Christians. Point was that they were Christians who believed in the Arian heresy, which the Council of Nicaea, convened by Constantine in 325, dismissed as a heresy. So they're really Christians, but with a slightly different doctrinal commitment, which mattered lots, and to you, many of you, it may still matter massively. It is important, but fundamentally, they believed in God and they believed in Christ. So even the loss of the Roman Empire and its replacement by these various Germanic tribes is not a loss of Christianity in the broader sense. Okay, another question here. Did at any point the invasion of barbarians or Germanic tribes contribute or even have an influence to the fall of the Roman Empire? Yes, so very much so. As I said, movements of peoples, whether we call them barbarians or Germanic tribes, all of those names we saw, the Vandals, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Angles, the Saxons, these are all Germanic in some sense, and to Romans, barbarian. They had a major effect because in destabilizing the Roman rule throughout the empire and causing civil strife that effectively never ended, the already shaky institution of the Western Roman imperial line was reduced to being nothing more than a puppet show and a man putting his 10-year-old son as the final emperor for 10 months. So yes, exactly that. One other question here that I see, it's a question about what would be your top choices for studying Rome's decline. Are you familiar with the works of Rostovtsev, J.B. Berry, Guglielmo Ferrero, or Ferdinand Lott? I'm familiar with most of those. Rostovtsev, very hard name to say, Russian economic historian who completely reframed our understanding of the later Roman Empire, is exceptionally important. But he writes a lot and he's very technical. Similarly, J.B. Berry, writing in the late 19th, early 20th century. These are important peoples, no question. It's very difficult to know where to start with the fall of the Roman Empire because, as I've gestured to, it's so vast and so immense that it's hard to point to anything in particular. There are many, many good accounts. I think what would be helpful for this individual is for you to email me. You can find my email online. And if you give me more of a sense as to what in particular you're interested in, given that you know these scholars already, I can do my best to give you pointers. But we have an embarrassment of wealth of places to look, not just modern, but also ancient sources too. Okay, onwards. Another question. Were the invaders or migrants more Christian than the empire itself in quality or quantity? Their quantity as a number of people will have been far smaller than the number of people living within the empire. That said, there is general demographic decline in the Roman Empire generally because of plagues and famines and droughts and wars and general depopulation of rural areas. Fewer and fewer people are actually alive within the Roman Empire. So, in that sense, the energy demographically is not within the empire. But I would have thought that the number of invading peoples in these tribes is not going to be more than some millions at most, rather than tens of millions. As to whether they were more Christian, I think the answer is going to be no as well. The majority of people in the empire by this point would have been Christian, maybe 40, 50 million by the time we get well into the 5th century. There's no way that that number of Christians were coming in with these Germanic tribes. Unfortunately, a lot of it's guesswork, but I think that much is going to be true. Okay, was there a decline in education and or literacy that may have contributed to Roman culture's inability to remain coherent? Yes and no. In Rome itself, despite the fact that the imperial court moves to Milan and then to Ravenna, the elite remain extremely educated and the school system survives and rhetoric remains important within the law. But because of the various civil strives and rise of different national interests, again, throughout the empire, the traditional Roman education becomes a rarer commodity for many within the empire. That, of course, has consequences because a lot of the Roman curriculum was built around the Roman imperial project. The Aeneid, written by Virgil in part to shore up Augustus's new conception of empire, was the major text read in school. And if from your earliest days you're reading about Jupiter telling Venus, Imperium sine fine dedi, I've given an empire without end, spatial and temporal, naturally that will instill a sense of imperial confidence in the Roman project, which you are part of by virtue of reading Roman literature. So there's a general decline in the cultural comfort throughout the empire, and that obviously has knock-on effects to education and to the production of written manuscripts, which allow the perpetuation of education. One thing I haven't had time to talk about is how the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century actually catalyzes and charges the survival of the Greco-Roman and Christian traditions, not within cities, not within imperial lines or dynasties, but within the monastery. The emergence of the monastic community by the 6th century really has momentum, and it's in those closeted, almost hermetic cultural communities that the literature of Greece and Rome, and indeed the philosophical and theological elements behind it, are preserved. So what we lose on the one hand, we gain with the other. Okay, there's lots of questions. I know we've passed our time. For anyone who has to disappear, thank you for being with us. I'm perfectly happy to keep answering questions, but please don't feel you have to stay indefinitely. I'm conscious we're past the time. Okay, so some other questions. After 380, was the spread of Christianity seen as uniting disparate peoples into a Roman identity? Good question. 380, as you'll possibly recall, was the year of the Edict of Thessalonica, when Christianity was explicitly made the state religion. It therefore meant thereafter that carrying out any of the polytheistic practices, the sacrifices, the rituals, the attendance of the temples, was an un-Roman activity. And there were penalties, and as the rule of Theodosius continued, temples were pulled down or converted, and certain practices were banned. So in that sense, not being Christian was reframed as not being a proper Roman. But whether Christianity spread at that point as a way of people to be more Roman, I'm not sure. I think the difference by this point is that the Romans have come to believe that the future of Christianity is intimately tied to the Roman Empire. The Christian God wants Rome to succeed. So not to fall in with Christianity as the religion of Rome is to be against the Roman project. How successful that was by the late 4th century, I don't know, but I suspect that it didn't work in all quarters. Okay, another question. If Arianism, so that's the heresy we mentioned, forced the Council of Nicaea, but the fall of Rome have been critical in fortifying Christianity and triune God belief today. Interesting. What's certainly true, and it always surprises me when I look into it. I'm no expert in theology in the early church, but what's really surprising about Christianity is that although being a scriptural religion, the answers are not clear in the New Testament as to the particulars of the doctrine, especially something as complex, as profound and almost unintelligible as the doctrine of the Trinity. That's not spelt out. What that means is that in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries AD, Christians are trying to work out at these large councils quite what should be their belief, their shared orthodoxy, and what shouldn't be. What are the wrong choices? What are the heresies? Generally, those decisions are made under pressure. That is to say, someone in some part of the empire starts promulgating a type of Christianity which is deemed wrong. And it's only from that pressure that orthodoxy is forced not to rethink its principles, but actually to refine them and make them clearer. So I like the thrust of your question, which is that given that Orthodox Christianity was knocked out by Arianism when Romulus was deposed, did that somehow fortify Christianity proper? And I think the answer is yes. The Eastern Empire, where Orthodox Christianity was continuing, would have felt further need to redouble its efforts against the Arian heresy now that the Western Empire was no longer under Orthodox rule. Of course, Justinian and his general Belisarius take back Italy about 50 years later, but that's another story. Okay. What's your opinion on the presence of the military in Italy and on the Italian border at this time? I presume that means in the 5th century, not in 2026. I think so. What's my opinion about the presence of the military? Well, it's difficult because the various Gothic tribes, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, are hanging around in Spain, Gaul, northern Italy. They have military power. They appear to be claiming that they just want a stable place to settle and to have economic and agricultural stability. But nevertheless, they have armies and they can pull levers such as invading Rome and other places when they need to. So I'm not really sure what my opinion is, but certainly it's a live factor on both sides that northern Italy is heavily militarized on both sides and the scope for peace is almost non-existent. This one's more of an order than a question. Comment on how the Roman civilization and the Greek civilization possibly interacted or influenced each other. No, I would love to do that, but that's absolutely massive. Of course, Greece came under Roman rule in the 2nd century BC, but Rome never escaped Greek influence. The interaction between the two is such a fascinating topic that I encourage the person who asked this question to come along to other Ralston conversations where we talk about that kind of thing. It's really interesting, but I'm very sorry I can't get into that now. Was there any foreboding about the possibility of collapse during the height of Rome? As civilizations rise, it feels almost too big to fail. But history never fails to correct this assumption. Feels as though modern man has forgotten this again. Depends what the height of Rome means. If that means 1st century BC AD. Yeah, you are right that there was, alongside all the braggadocio, the jingoism, the propaganda about Rome going to last forever, intelligent writers and thinkers and contemporaries were reflective on the state of the empire. You've already heard from me that by AD 68, a lot of serious Romans think they need to get out of this terrible nightmare of having emperors, but that fails. You have historians such as Tacitus writing really pessimistic accounts of the last 100 years of imperial rule and feeling that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And there's nothing destined about the future survival of Rome. You also have lots of moral critiques in this period about the decadence and decline that Roman luxury and success is bringing to traditional Roman principles. So you're exactly right that even at what we now call the high point, there are plenty of critiques and plenty of whisperings in the ear. Remember that you are mortal, going on. Whether this was conceived of as a cyclical process that everything ultimately must go full circle, or whether it was more teleological about where Rome is going to end, it differs between different thinkers. But you're exactly right. It was always a complex picture. Okay, there's a couple more, which I'll read. How does cultural decline correlate with the fall of the Roman Empire? For example, the decline and closure of the libraries in Rome as public institutions. Very good question. Correlate is the word because they are related. Clearly, the decline in economic and social terms of any given culture or civilization will have knock-on effects to what we might call its cultured output, whether that's educational, literary, philosophical, artistic, even theological. On the other hand, if those things themselves decline or stop, they catalyze and encourage the general decline of the civic entity, the project as a whole. You may know that famous line that Kenneth Clark gave in his wonderful television series Civilization, which is that it's lack of confidence more than anything else that kills a civilization. He continues, we can destroy ourselves by cynicism and disillusion just as effectively as by bombs. That is to say, once a populace ceases to have genuine belief in what it stands for as an entity, then that is as much a death knell to the future of that civilization as it is, as would be any external military threat. So I think they're intimately connected. Certainly, many of the things done after the Edict of Thessalonica were not helpful broadly for the cultural survival of the West. We can celebrate the survival of Christianity if we wish, but probably the final destruction of the library at Alexandria, a great repository of Greco-Roman learning, ended up being lost when the Serapeum, the temple to Serapis in Alexandria, was burned because it was not Christian. And it seems as though the fire might have got out of hand and burned what remained of an already embattled library there. So one thing any individual community needs to remember is that as soon as you become dogmatic and want to close down specific things which you think are not on message, you start to act in a way which quite rapidly can cut at the very threads which your civilization relies on. So pluralism and tolerance are often the strengths, not the weaknesses, of a great culture. Okay, I'll take one more, just so I don't keep you too long. Final question. Was the Roman Empire doomed by the political structure of the Republic? a government structure set up for a city-state that was unsuited for the largest empire the world had seen spirals out of control. The republic becomes a tyranny, and the end only becomes a matter of time. Thank you for that observation. I think there's a lot of truth to it. So again, it ties into this problem that Rome evolved into something that it simply cannot sustain as a successful city. Is the Republic the problem itself? If we look in the 1st century BC, we do find figures who dominate politics by virtue of breaking the rules. And whether it's Marius and Sulla, or Pompey and Caesar, or down the line, Octavian Augustus, and Antony, they all have the same thing in common, which is that military prowess, conquest, and the financial resources that come from that success are major engines in getting you not just into power, but allowing you to hold power. And all of those 6 names I've given are somehow able to use military victory and the triumphs that attend on that as a hack of the system. Eventually, that system collapses when, allegedly for the safety of the empire, Augustus must act as its sole ruler, and I've told the story from that point. But you touch upon something really interesting, which is that, is the Republic the problem there? I would say yes, but only indirectly. And by that I mean this, which indeed is counterintuitive. The Republic as set up was a successful system. It lasted for 500 years because no single person could really arrogate much power to himself. But by virtue of being so stable and so successful, it created a stability that allowed for widespread military conquest over the map behind me for hundreds of years. And it was that created the problem, because once you had a huge military force, which meant standing armies all around the empire with immense power and immense allegiance to their general and not to the consuls of that given year, you had started to imbalance where true power lay. And the peace that Rome expected from its fellow Romans no longer was sustainable when Caesar found that crossing the Rubicon was a quick way of getting what he wanted. So civil war ends up being a consequence of Roman military success. And therefore, if pressed, I would say the Republic was not the problem. The problem was that in the Mediterranean basin from the 2nd century BC onwards, it was possible, after the destruction of Carthage and the conquest of Greece, for the enterprising and acquisitive, and in many senses ruthless and brutal, Roman machine to expand to a scale that the Republic could never maintain. So I, at any rate, don't blame the Republic for the creation of the imperial period, but I do see, paradoxically, how its stability created the conditions for its own destruction. Okay, well, for those of you who are still with us, thank you so much for staying on longer than expected. I'm well aware, of course, that I've only scratched the surface of all the things I've mentioned, but I'm very grateful to all of you, and indeed, thank you again to Connor and Rosa Maria for spending time. That's my children. Sorry, this evening in discussing this enduring question. We don't have the answers, but hopefully we have more to discuss in the days, weeks, and years to come. Thank you.